I reviewed all the body-worn videos, all the other videos that were provided to me that were cell phone videos, poll videos, things of that nature, reports, manuals from the Minneapolis Police Department, as well as the training materials.
And based upon your review of these materials and in light of the Graham factors, what is your opinion as to the degree of force used by the defendant on Mr. Floyd on the date in question?
My opinion was that the force was excessive.
And what was your assessment?
Initially, when Mr. Floyd was being placed in the backseat of the vehicle, he was actively resisting the officers. So at that point, the officers were justified in utilizing force to try to have him comply with their commands and to seat him in the backseat of the vehicle. However, once he was placed in the prone position on the ground, he slowly ceased his resistance, and at that point, the officers, ex-officers, I should say, they should have slowed down or stopped there.
So first, I'm going to ask you a few questions so we can get to know you a little better. How old are you?
23.
23. And are you originally from Minnesota?
No.
Where did you grow up?
No, I'm from Arizona.
You can kind of pull back. You're actually speaking.
I'm sorry. I don't like this. Okay.
I understand. Yeah, I just need to speak coincidentally.
Okay, are we good? All right.
Thank you. And you can even pretend you're yelling at me if you want to, or make your voice hit the back of the room. All right?
Okay.
So you said that you grew up in Arizona. Is that right?
Yep.
What part of Arizona?
Just Arizona.
The whole state?
Yep.
Okay. When did you make your way over to Minnesota?
I don't know. A while ago.
Were you still in high school?
Yeah.
Did you attend any schools when you moved to Minnesota?
Yeah.
Where did you go to school?
Red Wing.
In Red Wing, Minnesota. Where else did you go?
St. Paul.
St. Paul. Okay. What's the last grade you completed through high school?
11th.
Okay. Can you tell the jury the different cities or towns that you've lived in since coming to Minnesota?
I guess Minneapolis.
Okay. Minneapolis, and I assume Red Wing for one?
Yeah, St. Paul.
And St. Paul. Okay. Are you currently employed?
No.
Can you tell the jury a little bit about the types of jobs that you've held?
I used to work at Speedway.
And which Speedway do you recall the location?
38th in Chicago.
Right. What did you do at Speedway at 38th in Chicago?
I'm a shift lead.
Shift lead? What does that mean?
Not like a regular employee, but not a manager, like kind of in the middle.
Okay. So not a lot of us have had the experience of working as a shift lead at Speedway, so I'd like you to just tell the jury a little bit of what's your day-to-day job like when you have that job?
I work at a cash register. I do paperwork. If a customer has an issue, I handle the issues.
Okay. You also work as a cashier?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have to train other people or supervise other cashiers?
Sometimes.
How long did you have that job, Miss Layler?
About a year.
Did you start as a shift lead, or did you have a different position? You started as a shift lead? Can you tell the jury a little bit about the types of hours you would work there? Was it a full-time job?
Yep, I work 40 hours a week. I did.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay. When did you typically start your shift?
Between 2 or 3 to closing, 10 o'clock.
10 o'clock was closing?
Yep.
Was it a pretty busy store?
It has its moments.
Okay. Well, I'd like to see if you recognize the area. First, I'd like to show just the witness what's been marked for identification as Exhibit 1. Oh.
Right. All right, Mr. Swisher.
Thank you. Ms. Euler, we're ready for you now. I'm going to show you, first I'm going to offer Exhibit 1.
No objection. One, two, three.
And then I'm going to show you Exhibit 1. If you can take a look at the screen. It's just the one in front of you.
Oh.
All right. Do you recognize what's shown in Exhibit 1?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you see the speedway where you used to work?
Yeah.
I'm going to speak up a little bit.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right. So, do you have something that looks like this in front of you? A little stylus? All right. What I'd like you to do is just take this and see if you can draw a circle around the speedway where you used to work. Thank you. All right. And the name of the store directly across the street, were you familiar with that?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
And what's the name of that store?
Cuff Foods.
You ever go in that store? Were you a customer there?
Not really.
Not really. Just a place across the street where you worked?
Yeah.
Okay. And then do you see what's directly across the street if you cross 38th Street from Cup Foods?
Yeah.
Do you recognize that building?
Yeah, I didn't know that's what it was, though.
What did you know it as?
I never really paid attention to it.
Okay. Well, do you recall whether or not you were working on May 25, 2020, Memorial Day?
Yeah.
And where were you working?
At Speedway.
At Speedway. All right. And do you recall when you began your shift?
About 3 o'clock.
And do you recall specifically what you were doing at the Speedway that day?
Ringing up customers.
And at the cash register?
Yeah.
Can you just, again, using your stylus, point or maybe put a little X around the area in front of the store where the cash register would be?
Like right here.
Okay. Are you able to see the outside across the street from the cash register?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes? And you said you began working at 3. I'd like to draw your attention to a little after 8 o'clock in the evening that day. Do you recall something that caught your attention outside of the Speedway?
Yeah.
Can you tell the jury what caught your attention?
The police, like in that area, it's always police.
When did you first notice, or where did you first notice the police?
I would say like on the corner, right, like diagonal, like across the street, like right here. Oops.
Okay. And so for the record, that's across from Cup Foods, across 38th Street in what is labeled on Exhibit 1 as Dragon Walk. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
All right. Please tell the jury in your own words what it is you saw that caught your attention.
Just the police, try not to cuss, just them messing with someone.
Okay. And when you say messing with someone, and thank you for not cussing, but when you say messing with someone, could you please describe what you mean by that?
Like, I don't really know how to explain it, just like disturbing somebody before I found out who it was.
Okay. Now, did you eventually find out who the person the police were disturbing in your words?
Yeah.
Who's that?
George Floyd.
Had you ever met this person before?
No.
To your knowledge, you've never been a customer in the Speedway?
No.
Okay. Can you please describe for the jury what you saw after you first noticed the police having this interaction with the person you now know to be Mr. Floyd?
Can you say that again?
So can you just describe, after you first noticed the police having this interaction with Mr. Floyd, what did you see happen?
In my handcuffs.
You saw. Where was Mr. Floyd when you saw him in handcuffs?
Over here, across the street.
Okay. In the area where you first indicated by the Dragon Walk?
I believe so, yeah.
And then what did you see happen after Mr. Floyd was in handcuffs?
I don't remember.
What's the next thing you do remember?
Oh, God.
Are you a little nervous today?
Yeah.
Well, that's okay. Just take your time. And we have plenty of time to get through this, okay? And so, just backing up, you'd indicated that Mr. Floyd was in handcuffs, and just think to yourself what you next remember seeing after you noticed he was in handcuffs.
I think they ended up putting him in the police car thing.
And which police car? Where was the police car that you saw?
The one right across from Cut Foods.
Okay. Now, before you saw that, did you see the police take Mr. Floyd across the street?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes? All right. So after you saw him in handcuffs, you saw him being taken across the street and then placed in the car right outside of Cut Foods. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And you owned a cell phone, correct?
Yeah.
You owned a cell phone at the time. Yes?
Yes.
And did you do anything with your cell phone as you began to notice this incident involving Mr. Floyd and the police?
Well, as you guys seen that on the security thing that I had my phone.
Right, you had your phone. Did you do anything with your phone?
Like recording it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'd like you to do first, before we get to the point where you start recording, just explain to the jury what you saw after you noticed the police officers putting Mr. Floyd in the car.
I don't remember.
Okay.
I can't think right now.
Well, you indicated that you began recording with your cell phone. Is that right? Mm-hmm. And during the time that you've been speaking to the police about this, you've provided your cell phone recordings to law enforcement. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
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 All right. And there were a total of 7 cell phone recordings that you personally took. Is that correct?
Yes.
You've reviewed each of those cell phone recordings, correct?
Yeah.
And those cell phone recordings, do they fairly and accurately depict what you saw on the street that day?
Yeah.
And 2 of those cell phone recordings were actually made from inside the store, correct?
Yes.
And then the rest were outside of the store.
Yeah.
Now, those cell phone recordings, the individual clips, have been marked and disclosed to counsel as exhibits 2 through 8. You wouldn't know that, but they have. And at this time, I'm going to offer exhibits 2 through 8. Yeah.
Any objection?
No, you're right.
2 through 8 are received.
And then, Ms. Euler, you also had an opportunity to review a surveillance video. Is that right?
Yes.
And the surveillance video, for the record, is Exhibit 11. Having reviewed that video, did that video, fairly and accurately capture things that you observed when you were working at Speedway on the 25th?
Yes.
And then you were able to review that surveillance video in a format in which all of your cell phone videos, or I guess I should say 6 of the 7 cell phone videos, had been spliced into or put next to the surveillance video, correct?
Yes.
And that kind of gives a perspective of when those individual videos were shot. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then the combination of the 6 videos that we've just received and Exhibit 11, which has been offered and received, would that composition better help you and assist you in explaining your testimony to the jury?
Yes.
All right. And that, for the record, is Exhibit 9. I offer Exhibit 9.
Any objection? 9 is received.
And at this time, I'm going to go ahead and publish Exhibit 9. I ask you to take Exhibit 1 down. And when I say publish, I mean I'm going to play it. And at times I'm going to stop and pause and have you explain some things. All right?
Okay.
All right. If we could begin publishing Exhibit 9, please. And I believe we're paused at 7 seconds. At this point, you can see, and I'm going to place a circle around the officers. You see them there?
Yes.
And are those the people that you saw interacting with the person you now know to be Mr. Floyd?
Yep.
And your first interaction that you noticed was actually across the street by the Dragon Walk. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, as Mr. Floyd's being taken over the car, I think that we will soon hear your first recording. So if we could resume play. Exhibit 203, which we won't publish at this time, contains some training records. And those training records indicate that crisis intervention training was offered within 2016 and also 2018. And I'd like to talk to you about the larger block, the 2016 block. Now, first I have to ask you, do you recognize the name Derek Chauvin?
Yes.
How do you recognize it?
I recognize the name Derek Chauvin through training.
Okay. You're familiar with this person?
No.
Would you recognize him if you saw him?
Yes.
All right. Do you see him in the courtroom today?
He has a mask on. I'm assuming that's him.
All right. May the record reflect that the witnesses identified the defendant.
Record also reflect.
Exhibit 203, the training records indicate that in 2016, the defendant participated in a lengthier course, approximately a 40-hour course in crisis intervention training. Are you familiar with that type of course, the 40-hour crisis intervention training course?
Yes.
And is that a course that you've personally participated in as a student?
That course was delivered to the department, to the officers by Minnesota CIT Officers Associations.
And can you, just in general terms, explain what that course covers?
That course covers individual in crisis, symptoms, and de-escalation strategies that may be used for individual in crisis. So it's a scenario-based training.
What do you mean by that?
The trainer, Minnesota CIT Officers Association, brings in professional actors to come in and to conduct crisis scenarios where they're in a state of crisis, and then our officer has to use de-escalating strategies to bring them down to pre-crisis level or to help them out.
And so the officers are given an opportunity to practice recognizing what may be signs of persons in crisis and respond appropriately?
Yes.
Right. I'd like to talk to you about a related concept. You're familiar with the critical decision-making model?
Yes, I do.
How are you familiar with that model?
I attended the critical decision-making model was introduced to us by the police executive research forums. I, along with some of my colleagues, we attended a training session that was conducted by a representative from PERF, or the police executive research forums. and we adapted that model to MPD's use to guide our officers in their decision-making process.
And does the critical decision-making model, is there an application to crisis intervention?
Yes, it does.
Also an application to use of force?
Yes.
And sometimes those decisions will have to be made contemporaneously, is that right?
Yes.
At this time, I'd like to publish Exhibit 276, the critical decision-making model. You recognize this document?
Yes, sir.
And this is the critical decision-making model with which you're familiar?
Yes, sir.
Could you please explain, based on your familiarity with this graphic, the middle circle?
The middle circle, what you see in the middle circle are voice, neutrality, respect, and trust. Those are the pillars of procedural justice that was introduced to the department.
What is procedural justice?
Procedural justice basically is the legitimacy in our action. What we do, our action legitimate, and that is what procedural justice is about, is legitimacy.
And the training center also offers courses in procedural justice as well, is that right?
That is correct, yes.
This critical decision-making model is adapted in part from those materials, the procedural justice materials.
That is correct, yes.
Okay. Now, going back to the outer part of the circle, the first step of information gathering, and you see that it goes kind of a wheel that's supposed to represent critical decision-making or thinking, is that right?
That is correct.
Would you please, we've heard a little bit about this critical thinking decision-making model already, but I'd like you to discuss how this works in the context of crisis intervention, starting with the first block.
Starting is information gathering. We believe that this model has application not only for crisis, but especially for crisis. That is why it is part of our crisis curriculum. And the first circle, what you see there is information gathering. And information gathering is really crucial to what tactics or what decisions we're going to make. And information gathering could be based on dispatch, or it could be based on their own officer's observation.
Observations of what?
Observation of the scene, observation of the person, could be observation of the environment that's going on.
And some of these observations, for example, could just be physical observations, right? The officer could look at the person and make some sort of an assessment as to whether or not there's a behavioral crisis.
Yes.
Listening, is that also important?
Listening is important, yes.
Any other information that an officer would generally assess or take in when considering whether a person is in crisis?
Even listening is key. Other observation, even touch, for example, if you observe hands on the person, you can sometimes sense tensing up, and you can tell that maybe the person's in crisis or not. So,
then going to the next step, taking that information and potentially assessing it. What's the threat risk assessment block?
Risk is the possibility that something bad or dangerous may happen. And threat, in a sense, is the danger, and whether that danger is going to cause harm or not.
Now, with risk, you say it's the potential, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that the person is being threatened or themselves is threatened. Is that right?
That is correct, yes, sir.
It's just the mere possibility. And many people could present some sort of a risk. Everybody presents some sort of a risk, right?
Yes.
And it's up to the officer in the information gathering to determine whether that risk is small, large, or elevates to a threat.
Sustained.
And how does the, I apologize, Your Honor, how does the officer then assess whether or not a risk is small, large, or could develop into a threat?
That is up to the officers and the totality of circumstances and information they have at that time.
The next step then, after the threat or risk assessment, authority to act, could you please describe how that step is taken in the context of crisis intervention?
The authority to act is based on our policy, also based on state statutes and case law too, for individual in crisis. And those are some of the authority that we have in handling people in crisis.
some of those policies and the authority could include the use of force policy,
Yes.
the de-escalation policy,
Yes.
and the crisis intervention policy.
Yes, sir.
The next step, then, goals and actions. Please describe the thinking model in terms of crisis intervention regarding goals and actions.
Goals in action is also contingency based on the information. Really, the ultimate goal in action of somebody in a crisis is to see if that person needs help and what kind of help. Does that person need to go to the hospital, or does this person can be turned over to somebody that has the authority to watch over that person? So it's really to go for somebody in crisis is determined to see if that person needs help.
And then the next block in terms of crisis intervention, review and reassess. Could you please describe how that works in this scenario?
Review and reassess is as information becomes available. We continuously review and reassess the situation to see if our technique on de-escalation or other technique is working. If it's not working, then we adjust our technique, strategies.
Could you also then go backwards and adjust your goals and actions?
Yes, you can.
So, for example, if initially the goal is to arrest someone, after taking in information, if you determine the person needed medical attention, could you act on that?
Yes.
And then what would the action be if the person was in need of medical attention?
That would be the immediate goal for us. If somebody's in need of medical attention, then we give them medical attention.
Okay. And then that would also relate to backwards to the authority to act. Is that right?
Yes.
Looking at the policy, and there's a duty to provide medical attention in the policy, right?
Yes.
Now, how is this critical decision-making model imparted to Minneapolis police officers in the training program?
We believe in the application of these critical decision-making models. So I introduced this model with approval, of course, to the department in 2018.
And, you've been in the situation where you've had to use force before. You were in the field for a long time. Do you have an assessment as to whether or not this model is useful in the field?
I believe it's useful. That is why we introduced this model and introduced it to the officers.
And is it practical?
It is practical. Yeah, I believe it is practical.
And can you explain how so? I mean, some of these situations involving police officers occur fairly quickly. Is that right?
That is true.
Is it possible for a police officer to use this critical thinking model in the field when when events are unfolding quickly?
It is possible. To rehearse and reusing this model, it will almost be like it could be almost like memory. And when we talk about fast evolving situations, I know that they do exist, they do happen, but a lot of the time, we converse of that is that a lot of the time we have the time to slow things down and reevaluate, reassess, and go through this model.
Do you provide this training because you believe it works?
I provide this training because I believe it works, yes.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts.
It's been more than 8 months since the police killing of George Floyd. Next month, the former police officers charged in his death will go on trial in Minneapolis. Earlier this week, the Marshall Project, in partnership with the New York Times, found new first-hand accounts that former officer Derek Chauvin, who was seen with his knee on Floyd's neck for more than 8 minutes, had acted with that same kind of force before. I spoke with the Marshall Project's Jamiles Larte and Abby Van Sickle, who interviewed several who say they were also victims of Chauvin's use of excessive force. When you look back and talk to other people who have had these interactions with Officer Chauvin, what is the picture that we get?
Yeah, I think the picture that we get is from a number of folks who have had other interactions with law enforcement. The way Derek Chauvin treated them, the way he interacted with them was beyond the pale. It was different. That was something that I heard in every interview, really, that there seemed to just be maybe a heartlessness, a callousness to their pain, to their cries for air or help, or even just the feeling that this is unnecessary, right? This is so over the top.
How many people came forward, and what was it like when you all spoke to them?
Yeah, so we were able to identify 6 instances where the Attorney General had concluded that Chauvin may have used excessive force, and we were able to find 3 of those people, and then we were able to find the witness to a fourth incident.
Abby, what was the conversation like with some of these individuals when they're telling you that they also were struggling to breathe under the officer?
So one of the things that surprised us in the reporting is that they had not told their stories before. We were the people explaining that this was the same officer from the George Floyd case. Like, for example, the witness who I interviewed, he said that he had seen this arrest happen. And as he was recalling it, he said, one of the weirdest things is how they just kept this man's head in the puddle. This one officer kept his face down. He was just mentioning it so casually, like it's the thing that's always bothered him, but no one had ever asked him about it. I thought people would have already talked with them and they would know what had happened and their place in this, enormous case.
The stunning thing is not just that you spoke to these individuals that had found themselves in the same situation, but that somehow nothing happened to the officer, that he was still on the force.
When we look at Derek Chauvin's behavior, in real time, there was no official discipline for any of these. Minneapolis does have what's called a coaching program in its police department where officers can be sort of corrected in their approach to use of force rather than reprimand. And those records are not public. So we would not know if Officer Chauvin was coached in any of these instances. But what we do know is that there was no official determination of wrongdoing by the department in any of these. And the majority of them happened after the Minneapolis Police Department had voluntarily worked with the Department of Justice to revamp its accountability measures, including that coaching program. So I think it's a good reminder that departments can be making efforts that look productive and look progressive, and still have a lot of potentially criminal or potentially acts that are violating people's civil rights or violating use of force principles going unchecked.
So, Abby, one of the stories that you dove into is going to show up in the court proceedings against Officer Chauvin, but you also read that the prosecutor is picking a case where Officer Chauvin did the right thing. Why?
He and the other officers received a commendation for the way that they handled a case. And the prosecutors in their court filings have pointed to wanting to show he knew how to use force. He had been trained in the appropriate use of force, that he knew how to do it. And so that's why it looks like this other case may be something that the jury hears.
Were either of you surprised when you found these individuals? What was that moment like when they recognized that this could have been them?
None of the folks who we spoke to were sort of surprised that this officer had other instances that we could point to that may have been excessive uses of force. None of them were surprised that there were officers on the Minneapolis Police Department who routinely engaged in excessive use of force and were not punished for those things. None of that was surprising. Yeah, and I'll say, in Zoya Code's case, she remembered Chauvin. She also knew Philando Castile. So I think Zoya's story is really powerful to me because, in a sense, it is the connection point between these two fatal incidents, Philando Castile in 2016 and George Floyd in 2020, that were flashpoints in our national conversation about policing.
Jamal Zarte, Abby Van Sickle, both from the Marshall Project. Thanks so much for joining us.
Let's be clear. We've all seen the video by now. It's obvious these former police officers killed George Floyd. The Hennepin County medical examiner and the medical examiner hired by the family of George Floyd have concluded that his death was a homicide, but their opinion differs on the cause of death. But if both of them declared that his death was a homicide, does the cause of death really matter? Yes, because the trial is going to involve all of these former police officers, and their defense will likely hinge on this specific topic. Now, I want justice for George Floyd, and that's why I'm making this video, because the medical explanation for the cause of his death is not a simple explanation. It's actually more complicated than most people think. So I'm going to break down from a medical standpoint what led to his death. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Mike Hansen. I'm board certified in 3 specialties: internal medicine, pulmonary disease, and critical care medicine. As a pulmonologist, part of my job is to figure out why people can't breathe. As an intensive care doctor, part of my job is to care for people who are on the brink of death, like when someone can't breathe. Sometimes people die in the intensive care unit, and part of my job entails pronouncing death and then completing a death certificate form where I have to put down what caused the death. And this is more of a gray area than most people realize, because the cause of death is just about always multifactorial, meaning there are actually lots of causes that either directly or indirectly lead to death. So I'm going to ignore the topic of brain death because that's a separate discussion by itself and not really pertinent to this video. So for all intents and purposes, when someone dies, that means their heart stops pumping and they stop breathing. This is known as cardiopulmonary arrest. Most people don't know that in most states, I'm not allowed to write cardiopulmonary arrest as a cause of death. And that's because it's not really a cause of death, because it's always something that leads to cardiopulmonary arrest. So there's always an underlying cause of death that leads to cardiopulmonary arrest. For example, let's say someone has a viral infection that causes pneumonia and ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome. And let's say their organs started shutting down because of this. So they have kidney failure, liver failure, etc. What would be the cause of death in that scenario? The answer would be essentially all of the above. The virus started it all, and that led to them getting ARDS, and they couldn't breathe on their own. And as a result of this, their organs started dying, and ultimately that led to cardiopulmonary arrest. Now, what if I told you that that patient was a smoker and had diabetes and high blood pressure and were morbidly obese? Well, those are all indirect contributors to the cause of death, but not direct causes. So really, it's always a multitude of factors that contribute, some more than others, and some more direct, while others are more indirect. Another example is, let's say, when someone with cancer is getting chemotherapy and their immune system is severely weakened, meaning it's suppressed because of that chemotherapy. Well, if they get a bacterial infection that spreads throughout their entire body, meaning sepsis, they then go into septic shock and multi-organ failure, and then cardiopulmonary arrest. Well, what's the cause of death in that scenario? Well, it's really all of the above. They're all interconnected and they all play a part in that. So not always, but usually the cause of death is multifactorial. Now, before I get to what asphyxia means, we need to understand some basic human anatomy and physiology. Our breathing is actually controlled by our brain. Some of our breathing is controlled consciously with a big part of your brain, the cerebrum. But most of our breathing is not done consciously and is controlled by the very central core of our brain, the pons and the medulla. The pons and medulla are very sensitive to 3 things. 1, a decrease in oxygen level. 2, elevated levels of carbon dioxide. And 3, a decrease in the blood pH. If any of these occur, the brain will then tell the muscles that control breathing to start breathing faster and deeper. 90% of the work of breathing is done by the diaphragm. That's the big muscle that goes right here. The rest is done by the accessory muscles of breathing, such as intercostal muscles, which are the muscles that are in between your ribs. The diaphragm's job becomes harder when someone has a big belly, such as with pregnancy or morbid obesity, or when someone puts weight on your back if you're in the prone position. When this happens, there's decreased chest wall compliance, and if it's severe enough, it falls under the category of restrictive lung disease. For example, when someone is morbidly obese, they have restrictive lung disease. But let's say no one is sitting on your chest or your back, and the diaphragm is able to contract without any issues. When that diaphragm contracts, it creates a negative pressure inside your chest, a vacuum effect. This causes air to flow from your mouth and your nose through your windpipe, meaning your trachea, and then into your lungs, and this process expands your lungs. If you zoom into the microscopic level of your lungs and take a look at the alveoli, that's where oxygen moves from the air into your bloodstream. To be more specific, that oxygen diffuses from the alveoli to the capillaries that surround your alveoli. Capillaries are the tiniest blood vessels in your body. The oxygen diffuses to the red blood cells and binds to something called hemoglobin. 99.9% of the oxygen in your blood is bound to hemoglobin. The more hemoglobin you have, the more oxygen you have in your blood. This is known as blood oxygen content. But now we have to deliver that oxygen to different organs of the body, such as the brain. So how does it get there? The heart has to pump that newly oxygenated blood from the lungs and get it to the brain using certain arteries. The amount of oxygen the heart is able to pump to the body is known as oxygen delivery. There are 4 main arteries in the neck that deliver blood to the brain. You have 2 carotid arteries right here, and then you also have 2 vertebral arteries back here. They essentially go the same track as your spinal column. While all of this happens, carbon dioxide, which is a waste product of your body, needs to be removed from the body, which happens when you exhale. The blood that is delivered from the body and back to the lungs contains a lot of carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide then diffuses from the red blood cells to the alveoli, and then you exhale out that carbon dioxide. So in the alveoli, oxygen is going into the blood and carbon dioxide is leaving the blood. So now that we understand some basic human anatomy and physiology, let's turn to the medical term asphyxia. This is a Greek term that literally translates to stopping of the pulse. It's a generic term that refers to a condition in which there's inadequate delivery of oxygen to the body's tissues, often accompanied by a retention of carbon dioxide. There are hundreds of different reasons why this can happen. Usually when a medical examiner is using the word asphyxia, they're referring to airway compromise or compromise of blood flow to the brain, such as with mechanical asphyxia. But more on that in a little bit. So if someone were to die because of, let's say, a gunshot wound to the heart, technically it would fit that definition of asphyxia, but we would never say that said person died of asphyxia. We would say they died because of a gunshot wound that caused hemorrhagic and or cardiogenic shock, leading to cardiopulmonary arrest. So when someone dies of asphyxia, as is the case of George Floyd, the determination of cause of death is dependent on information that's elicited based on the investigation. And this includes the deceased's personal medical history, the autopsy findings, the crime scene investigation, which of course includes video evidence. Mechanical asphyxia involves some physical force or physical abnormality that interferes with the uptake and or delivery of oxygen. In asphyxial deaths, the brain doesn't get enough oxygen, and when the pons and the medulla aren't getting enough oxygen, they can no longer function, which means they can no longer tell the diaphragm to contract, and the breathing then stops. While this happens, the heart is also not getting enough oxygen, and typically, when that happens, the heart pumps slower and slower until it stops. This process is accelerated if there's an underlying lung disease or underlying heart disease. Alternatively, instead of the heart slowing down before it completely stops, it can go into a fatal arrhythmia, such as ventricular fibrillation, and then completely stop. Now let's talk about some of the different types of mechanical asphyxia. There's choking, there's drowning, there's suffocation, meaning smothering, in which the nose and or the mouth are occluded. There's also compression asphyxia, which involves the presence of external force on the chest and or abdomen that prevents expansion of the chest, as occurs when a car falls on top of a mechanic. Positional asphyxia is caused by the position of the body or part of the body, leading to airway restriction, vascular compromise, or breathing fatigue. This can occur if someone is suspended upside down for a prolonged amount of time. When someone is handcuffed and in prone position, and they have weight on their back, and if it's severe enough to the point where they can't breathe, this would be a combination of compression and positional asphyxia. Prolonged, continuous application, typically minutes, of extreme pressure on the thorax, such as with the body weight of several officers, is capable of causing death. This is important because this contributed to the death of George Floyd. It wasn't just the knee to the neck. But now let's talk about asphyxia as it pertains to when there's pressure on the neck. The neck contains our airway. Right here is our trachea. And it also contains big blood vessels. As I mentioned, the carotid arteries right here, the vertebral arteries right here, but also the jugular veins, which go in parallel with the carotid arteries. The arteries here deliver oxygenated blood to the brain, while the jugular veins allow deoxygenated blood to flow from the brain down towards the heart. So what happens when pressure is placed on the neck? Well, it depends on a lot of different factors. Let's look at what happens with strangulation and hanging. Strangulation can be manual when hands or arms compress the neck, or it can be done with ligature, such as with a cord or a rope or a cloth, and that constricts the neck. Hanging is different from strangulation because the person's own body weight with gravitational force is the source of the neck pressure. Contrary to popular belief, there doesn't have to be full suspension of the body for hanging to cause unconsciousness or death. In other words, the body can touch the floor and still cause death. And there's actually two types of hanging. There's judicial hanging, which is designed to fracture and dislocate the upper cervical spine. And then there's non-judicial hanging, involving compression of the neck blood vessels with or without significant compression of the trachea. Restriction of blood flow to and from the brain is typically the major feature in non-judicial hanging or strangulation. In adults, there is a significant difference in the amount of force required to occlude the blood vessels in the neck and the trachea. Compression of the neck blood vessels without compressing the trachea can cause unconsciousness and death. In an adult, the amount of pressure necessary to occlude structures in the neck to the point of causing unconsciousness and death is estimated to be 4 to 5 pounds for the jugular veins and anywhere from 5.5 to 22 pounds for the carotid arteries, anywhere from 18 to 66 pounds for vertebral arteries, and to compress the trachea, it's about 33 pounds. So these are estimates, and in reality, it depends on the body habitus. Does the person have a skinny little neck or a thick muscular neck? It also depends on the exact location of pressure. Is the pressure on part of the neck or all of the neck? If it's only part of the neck, what part of the neck is it on? How long is the pressure applied for? Do they have underlying carotid artery disease, meaning do they have underlying blockages in the carotid arteries from atherosclerosis? And still, there are other more indirect factors as well, such as underlying heart disease, lung disease, and drug use. Another important question is, what are the autopsy findings in someone who dies of asphyxia? Well, I'll start out by saying there are no pathognomonic findings for asphyxia. By that I mean there aren't specific findings that only occur with asphyxia, and sometimes there are no findings at all with asphyxia. However, there are findings that are characteristic of different forms of asphyxia. The nature and extent of these findings depend on the kind of asphyxia. For example, in hanging and strangulation cases, there can be facial swelling, petechial hemorrhages in the face, eyes, and gums, which usually happens when arterial blood flow in the carotid arteries persists after jugular venous flow has stopped. Sometimes there can be skin markings such as scratches from nails or ligature marks. You can also have internal neck structure damage like hyoid bone and laryngeal fractures. In looking at what happened to George Floyd, it wasn't a hanging or a strangulation, so finding facial swelling or petechial hemorrhage would be less likely. Thankfully, there was a video in this case because had there not been, there would be no chance of these officers getting prison time. A big question that comes up is the timing of how long it takes for asphyxia to cause loss of consciousness, and how long does it take for the heart to stop after they lose consciousness? Well, that depends. There are a lot of variables, like what I mentioned earlier in this video. There have been experimental studies and videotaped events of hanging and strangulation that show rapid loss of consciousness after compression of the neck, typically within 20 seconds. In these instances, the last breath occurs no later than 2 minutes. But this is for hanging cases, which is not what happened to George Floyd. Unlike a hanging, where lack of circulation to the brain is the primary cause of death, when someone dies of asphyxia primarily because they can't breathe, meaning respiratory rest, they typically lose a pulse around the same time of when they stop breathing. And looking at the George Floyd video, he was unconscious for more than 2 minutes with the knee still on his neck. There's no doubt that during this time, he took his last breath right around the same time that he lost his pulse. By the time the EMS guy checks his pulse, I highly doubt he actually felt a pulse, because it was more than 2 minutes after George lost consciousness. It was obvious that when they moved George onto the stretcher, he was completely limp because he was dead. And it wasn't until much later did they start CPR in the ambulance. Now let's get to what the medical examiners had to say about this case. There was the Hennepin County medical examiner, and then there was the independent medical examiner, Dr. Michael Baden. The independent autopsy says Floyd died of, quote, asphyxiation from sustained pressure when his back and neck were compressed, with the neck pressure cutting off blood flow to his brain. I agree with that assessment. That's what happened. I would also add that partial compression of the trachea causing airway compromise was also possible, but there's no way to prove or disprove that because you don't know how much pressure was being applied to that trachea. We know that because George was talking at least some of the time, you can conclude that he did not have total tracheal occlusion for the entire duration of the knee being on the neck. But the weight on his back made the work of breathing much harder for his diaphragm to contract, and the neck pressure at the very least meant less oxygen was being delivered to his brain and less carbon dioxide could be removed from his brain. After a while, the diaphragm becomes fatigued and no longer has the strength to contract, which means the lungs can't get oxygen into the blood and can't get carbon dioxide out of the blood. And whatever oxygen was in his blood, well, less of it was being delivered to his brain because of that pressure on the neck. And all of this caused him to lose consciousness. And probably within seconds, he lost a pulse. And despite losing consciousness, and despite losing a pulse, they continued to apply pressure on the neck and their weight on his back as well. The Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office said that the cause of death is, quote, cardiopulmonary arrest complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression, end quote. This statement doesn't really make sense to me. It seems like it's trying to say that police restraint and neck compression caused cardiac arrest, which is like what we talked about, asphyxia, although they didn't use the word asphyxia, and it did not mention the weight that was being put on his back. But the Hennepin County release also says heart disease was an issue. The independent examiner didn't find that. The county said that fentanyl and methamphetamine were among significant conditions, but its report didn't say how much of either drug was in his system or how that may have contributed. So here's the thing. Let's say for a second, at least hypothetically speaking, he had underlying heart disease and he had fentanyl and methamphetamine in his system. So what? Could those have indirectly contributed to his death? Sure, but that's not the direct cause of his death. A better way to describe it would be to say they might have hastened his death had he not had heart disease or those drugs in his system. But either way, that's not what killed him. The officers had their weight on his back and pressure on his neck for a total of 8 minutes, 46 seconds, and for 2 minutes and 53 seconds after he lost consciousness. So Dr. Michael Baden got it right. But when he said, quote, police have this false impression that if you can talk, you can breathe, that's not true, end quote. Well, technically, if you're talking, you are breathing, because in order to talk, you need to exhale. The airflow going out through your vocal cords is what allows you to make the noise through your voice box. That's what the vocal cords are. The process of exhaling is part of breathing. So technically, what he said isn't true, but I get what he was trying to say. I agree with the point that he was trying to make, which is this. Just because someone can talk doesn't mean they're not on the brink of complete cessation of breathing. George was pleading to breathe. He was pleading for his life, and it was taken from him. They didn't even bother to save his life when they knew he was dead. There were bystanders there yelling at them to check for a pulse, check for a pulse. They didn't even check for a pulse. They didn't even bother to start CPR. There needs to be justice for George.